Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for coming. And we open our 14th ESEE conference. Will Achilles catch up with the Tortoise? I welcome you on behalf of the Leonardo, the Institute, Research Institute on the Environment and the Territory, who was in charge of the scientific preparation of this conference. I hope we did a good job. We will see in the next days. And I'm very pleased to introduce the Vice Mayor of the of Pisa municipality, Madam Bonsangue, Sandra Bonsangue, who will is representing here the mayor of Pisa. Please.
Good evening and welcome to Pisa for who does not live here in our town. It is a true emotion to be here among you, among the students, to inaugurate the 14th International Conference of the European Society for Ecological Economics. I take this opportunity to bring the greetings of the Mayor of Pisa, Michele Conti, and of the entire Municipal Council. I would like to thank the University of Pisa and especially the Department of Economics and Management, which organized the international conference in collaboration with the Leonardo IRTA Institute for Research on Territory and Environment. Exactly 50 years have passed since 1972, when the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm, where for the first time attention was drawn to the fact that in order to sustainably improve living conditions, there is the need to safeguard natural resources and for the benefits of all. This was well recognized, and international collaboration was necessary to achieve altogether this goal. In Stockholm, the emphasis was placed on solving environmental problems without, however, forgetting that these kind of problems are strictly connected to social ones, economic and development aspects. And it is precisely the approach and the choice of the interdisciplinary method that can guarantee the best solutions for the future of the earth and of the well-being of mankind. We all need to be more committed to future generations, important agents of change, whose role is essential to build a democratic, more inclusive, greener future, to give resources, ideas, and energy to our actions. Collaboration and sharing of experience between the university, local public bodies, and private individuals are essential to foster the adoption of good practices for the fair and sustainable management of territorial and environmental resources. Investments in environmental sustainability also pay off on the economic front. In fact, restoring environmental quality and territorial safety can produce development and growth for all the community. The ecological economic is by now part of both the academic and the political world, and it is linked to the challenges of the ecological transition underway in our country and in the European Union. The European way is the winning one, we think. And is only if we will be in a united community, we can overcome crisis, regaining true freedom amidst constant pitfalls. Today, Italy and Europe are huge building sites where all citizens are called upon to live actively both in civil society and in politics, with ethical, moral, and sustainability principles. From Pisa, from the heart of Italy, we dare to say, and Europe, all of us, women and men, are ready to do our part for the future of Italy, for the future of Europe, and for an eco-sustainable planet. Thank you.
And now, Paolo Mancarella. I introduce Paolo Mancarella, Rector of the University of Pisa. Please, Paolo.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Pisa and to our university. The University of Pisa is greatly honored to host the 14th Conference of the European Society for Ecological Economics. I think that during the next 4 days, it will place Pisa at the core of the debate on the relationships among ecological, social, and economic systems for the mutual well-being of nature and people. Being a core topic of our university's governance, I right away would like to thank our professor, Tommaso Luzzati, and the Leonardo Irta Research Institute for Territory and Environment for having put together an extremely high-profile program, which I'm really persuaded will let us come up with many significant guidance for the future. We see around us growing evidence of man-made harm in many regions of the Earth, dangerous level of pollution in water, air, earth, and living beings, major and undesirable disturbances to the ecological balance of the biosphere, destruction and depletion of irreplaceable resources, and gross deficiencies harmful to the physical, mental, and social health of man in the man-made environment, particularly in the living and working environment. I wish I could say that this representation is just a memory from the past, but it is not. It's awfully current. And yet, the words I've just quoted are now half a century old. They are an excerpt of the Stockholm Declaration drawn up at the end of the United Nations Conference on the Environment that Ms. Bostango just mentioned, whose 50th anniversary we will celebrate this year, the first World Conference to make the environment a major issue. While reading them, I think it's impossible for us, for all of us, not to feel a certain disappointment at how time can pass without producing substantial changes. Of course, it would be unfair saying that humankind has totally sat back in the face of the environmental crisis. But it's equally true that the governments and lobbies' economic interests have often prevailed over what we might simply define as the natural survival instincts of species. Even nowadays, despite a new sensitivity being surely present in our society, clear-cut decisions cannot be made and the goal has moved further away, just as happens in Zeno's paradox, which is so effectively evoked in this conference title. And there was little point in the appeals launched by the many little girls who over the years have shushed with their words the great ones of the world, attempting to reawaken our consciences, and bluntly reminded us how delicate the planet we live on is, and how much it's up to each of us to take care of it. I cannot hide that sometimes confidence in success seems to desert us, but we cannot indulge. The 2030 agenda goals and the daily news in an even more tangible way, ranging from the recent fires which devastated the Amazon rainforest, Canada and Australia, to the COVID-19 pandemic, to the crisis due to the war in Ukraine, tell us that our engagement with the world can no longer be delayed. In this scenario, universities, both because of their social role and as abundant collectivities, can play a key role in establishing a real culture of sustainability able to deeply permeate society, both at the level of individuals and business culture. This is an awareness that here in Pisa we have had for a long time. I wish to take today's opportunity to remember that the commitment towards sustainability is indeed deeply rooted in our university, that also included it in the statute and strategic plan, participating also in the RUS, the Network of University for Sustainable Development, with one of its representatives in the coordination committee. It was no accident, indeed, that today the culture and practice of sustainability are essential elements of our educational and research activities. Having realized that innovation is not necessarily a driver of development and that many current problems arise even from science, our university has long been engaged in an ongoing effort to raise the awareness of its researchers about the responsible research and innovation, the RRI approach. Not to mention the cutting-edge research activities on responsible management and development undertaken by our Responsible Management Research Center, REMARC, which as a unique model in Italy has joined the Network for Business Sustainability, the hugest world network of business centers for sustainability. Starting from this assumption, the University of Pisa has striven for several years to make a significant contribution to the transition process for a more sustainable development pattern through European projects funded by Horizon 2020 and the Coal Bio-Based Industries Joint Undertaking, BBIJU, as well as through national research projects funded through competitive calls by regions, foundations, and ministries, in addition to the resources from our own university. But this is also allowed by our important national and international collaborations. For instance, let's think about our agreement with MIT in Boston, allowing our current collaboration in a project related to the use of protein-rich biomass in the chemical industry and more specifically in the future biorefineries. Meanwhile, with regard to these issues, we are also actively participating in the Ministry of University and Research calls for the measures of the National Recovery and Resilience Plan, notably those for the funding on 5 national centers devoted to cutting-edge research activities, and that for the creation of partnerships extended to universities, research centers, companies, and the funding of basic research projects. But our university is also a member of the Bio-Based Industries Consortium, founder of the European Bioeconomy Alliance, aiming at the development of the bioeconomy in Europe. Moreover, we recently joined with 12 of our 20 departments in the Cluster Spring, which participates in the National Steering Committee on the Bioeconomy. Not to mention the work carried out by our interdepartmental centers, 3 of which clearly aiming at the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals stated by the United Nations Organization. The Research Center on Nutraceuticals and Food for Health, the Research Center Energy and Sustainable Development, and the Research Center Studies on Climate Change Impact. The last one was funded in 2018 with the aim, inter alia, to foster, coordinate, and develop studies and enhance the technology transfer of research results on issues concerning the climate change effects on the whole biota and their living environments. 4 years ago, the center commitment also flowed into an important day of study dealing precisely with the activities of the University of Pisa on the climate change effects, offering the many scholars of the university engaged in these issues an initial opportunity for discussion. More than 100 researchers were included who addressed highly topical issues involving many scientific areas, ranging from medicine to environmental biology, from veterinary science to economics, from geology to agricultural sciences. Moreover, that day was also a laboratory demonstrating that it's possible to reduce the environmental footprint of large events, To this aim, our university, inter alia, got so far as to plant trees in its green areas to offset the carbon dioxide emissions produced by the meeting organization. That was not the first time that our university performed such actions. I like to recall that almost 5 years ago, the University Green Data Center was inaugurated. It was built according to precise criteria to achieve a reduction in consumption and emissions, and designed following sustainability criteria. In more recent years, we also built a new educational center, being a bearer both of change and balance that firmly reunites it with the earth and the sky, the so-called Memorial Polo della Memoria San Rossore 1938. It was built aiming at sustainability with a geothermal system of field wells and integrated outlets, which self-powers its heating and air conditioning system without any CO2 emissions into the air, thus contributing to the well-being of future generations while fostering a positive response to our students' needs through its accessible and functional premises. Meanwhile, last year we launched a cross-cutting course, Agenda 2030 and Sustainable Development Goals, which is open to all our enrolled students and aims at using the multidisciplinary approach to make our students aware of sustainable development concept as they set forth in the 17 goals of the Agenda 2030. In the current academic year, we have also launched a new postgraduate program open to all graduates on sustainable development and climate change, and we have drastically reduced the use of plastic in all our premises and events. Thanks to our commitment and efforts, just in these days, we got to sign an agreement with UNESCO for the establishment of a chair on sustainable energy communities. Therefore, we will be able to be even more incisive in solving the energy issue, which is a crucial element of almost all the most important challenges and opportunities the world has to tackle and seize nowadays. Indeed, as the environmentalist and Goldman Prize winner, Miss Ika Langelei, aptly stated, to make the word sustainable come true, we must provide communities with the knowledge and tools to defend themselves. And this is exactly how the University of Pisa carries out its task of contributing to the cultural, civic, and economic progress of Italy through the pursuit of education and learning, the support of research of excellence, and the promotion of knowledge transfer and valorization in the context of sustainable development of territories, but also by actively participating in the political and economical processes that underlie the affirmation, also in Italy, of an eco-sustainable economic pattern. And this is because we are persuaded that the great battles of civilization are won when everyone can become part of the change. This is also the reason why I wanted to mention what our university is doing to allow that paradigm shift called for by many to become a reality. Your presence during these days in Pisa is a further stimulus for us to continue the journey we have undertaken to build a better world. It's time for the awareness developed since the Stockholm Conference in 1972 to finally bear hopeful fruit. Now, therefore, it only remains me to wish you all a good work. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you to the Rector, Paolo Mancarella, for his explanation of what University of Pisa is doing, has been done in these years for sustainable development of the institution. And I hope the university will continue his virtuous path about the abolition of plastic bottles, for instance, because I remind him that there are still 350,000 bottles of plastic bottles, small bottles, consumed in the premises, and So maybe this will be better off later on, I imagine, as well as maybe the convention to photovoltaic introduction of panels, maybe even on the public palaces of the mayors. Maybe an innovation will be useful in this field. Thank you. So I give the speech to the Director of the Department of Economics and Management, Professor Luca Spataro. Thank you. The department has been deeply involved in the preparation of this conference. Thank you.
Thank you. So, as a Director of the Department of Economics and Management, I would like, first of all, to thank the organizers of the conference, in particular Tommaso, who is here, and for inviting me. And I would also like to greet the Rector, the academic authorities, civil authorities, colleagues and students, and give a warm welcome to all the participants in this prestigious conference. The Department of Economics and Management here is a lively environment where research and teaching live side by side in the areas of economics, business and management, mathematics, statistics, and law. In recent years, the department has particularly increased its international activities by more than doubling the number of exchange students and exchange opportunities for both students and faculty members. Among other things, we have developed an international program for undergraduate and graduate students, an international BA in business, a master in economics and statistics, and several double degrees with foreign universities. So this is a little bit of advertising, so that's keep in mind that you are all welcome to come and visit our department. As far as research activity is concerned, it covers a lot of topics in the major fields of economics, finance, business studies, and applied maths and statistics, and law. Among other things, we have been participating into several research programs at international level, such as Horizon 2020 and Jean Monnet activities, promoting excellence in teaching and research in the field of European studies. We also provide a program for visiting fellows, and we host 2 PhD courses and several research centers concerned with economic growth, sustainability, statistics, history of economic thought. But let me spend a few words also as a scientific coordinator of the Jean Monnet project, assessing the EU strategy on green finance and ESG factors, whose final conference is taking place at the same Department of Economics in these days, and which have been collaborating also with all of you. In fact, we are very close, not only physically in these days, but also in terms of topics. In fact, the research focus of the project is concerned with socially responsible investments and integration of ESG factors in the finance of the European Union. As you know, in recent decades, SRIs have attracted considerable attention not only from individual investors and private citizens, but also from the scientific community. And initially promoted by small communities of institutional investors on an ethical basis, the development of socially responsible investing has continued and even intensified in recent years, particularly since the last financial crisis. Furthermore, in Europe, thanks to the Green New Deal and recovery plan, many investments will be directed towards companies that provide solutions to the challenges of the energy transition. The effects of these policies are already visible, and the influence will be even greater in the future. For all these reasons, I just want to tell you that I'm honored and grateful to contribute to this conference and to welcoming all of you. So, I know well as an economist, and also thanks to the activity of the colleagues of our department, that economics is not a purely technical or even sad discipline, but has a social soul That is, it is aimed at dealing with issues concerning the well-being of the community and the future of the next generations. Hence, I'm convinced that this conference will be a unique opportunity to explore issues that are on the frontier of scientific research and of the economic policy agenda of national and international governments. For all these reasons, I conclude by thanking the organizers again and wishing all participants good work. Thank you.
Thank you again, and welcome, and hope our work will be very, very useful for the planet, for all us. And I'll leave the floor to the following chairman for the beginning of the official program. Thank you.
I have a mic anyway. So. Oh, okay, perfect. All right, so yeah, we don't have to worry about that. Okay. Benvenuti a tutti. Hello, everyone. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 14th conference of the European Society for Ecological Economics. My name is Dan O'Neill, and I'm the president of the European Society. And it's been a while since our last conference, hasn't it? It's been over 3 years, and I think we're all pretty excited to be here in person. And this is certainly the most people that I've seen in one room in quite a while. So this is pretty exciting. 50 years ago, there was, of course, another conference, the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment, which was also held in June, but in Stockholm, Sweden. And it was the first conference to make the environment a major issue. Now, the same year, in 1972, we had the very famous publication of the book, The Limits to Growth. A year earlier, in 1971, Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen produced his very important and seminal book, The Entropy Law and the Economic Process. And in 1973, of course, Herman Daly published his collection of essays Towards a Steady State Economy. These works and others around the same time would go on to inspire the creation of ecological economics. Now, the fundamental idea of ecological economics is simple. The economy is a subsystem of the environment. But this simple idea has quite profound implications. First of all, it tells us that economic transactions, economic activity, is not just about financial transactions. It's also about biological and physical processes. And these can be analyzed and understood, not just in terms of flows of money, but also in terms of biophysical flows and their social outcomes. It tells us that many of the major environmental problems that we faced are caused by the scale of economic activity exceeding ecosystem limits. And while neoclassical economics argues that environmental problems can be solved simply by getting the prices right, ecological economics argues that externalities are pervasive, that they are an inevitable consequence of the scale of economic activity exceeding ecosystem limits. Now, one of the key messages of the limits to growth 50 years ago was that the limits are plural. They include scarcity of natural resources, persistent pollution, limits to efficiency improvements imposed upon us by the laws of thermodynamics, and delays between what we do to the environment, environmental damage, and its effects. If humanity circumvents one of these limits, the authors told us, we may simply expose another. It's a bit like a game of whack-a-mole where you knock down one of them and another one pops up somewhere else. Ultimately, economic growth cannot continue forever on a finite planet. Now, it's been 50 years since the limits to growth, and so maybe it's time for a bit of a midterm review. The limits to growth concluded that the planetary constraints required that humanity either stabilize economic output soon or face collapse sometime within the next 100 years. And now we are 50 years later. And we're currently transgressing 6 of the 8 planetary boundaries that have been quantified so far. It's getting quicker to list off the boundaries that we are not transgressing, ozone depletion and ocean acidification, than the ones that we are. So the title of this year's conference makes reference to Zeno's paradox of Achilles and the tortoise. Although Achilles is faster, he never catches the tortoise. And for ecological economists, it seems like every year the distance between what should be done and what is actually being done remains the same. The system remains locked in an unsustainable trajectory. Now, speaking of bordering on unsustainable, organizing a conference like this is a tremendous amount of work. And before we welcome our first speaker of this session, I would like to thank Tommaso, Tiziano, and all of the members of the local organizing committee who have really done a fantastic job putting this all together. And I think we're all super excited to see what the conference holds over the next few days. So I think, Tommaso, I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce our first speaker.
Yeah, I will say something later on. For the moment, I wish to thank you all, and also to introduce you briefly Enrico Morricone, like more or less 1 month ago on the football pitch, because we have been playing football together for at least 40 years, not 50, but at least 40 years. And I told him about the conference, about these strange titles. And then I asked him, why don't you come to the conference and better explain us about the change of paradigm? So now Enrico, who is really a great friend, has accepted to come and give us this very, very short speech with Zeno paradox for dummies. And then, so I ask Enrico, so will Achilles catch up with the Tortoise or not? So thank you very much, Enrico.
Thank you very much to the organizer for having involved me in this splendid meeting, important meeting. And good afternoon to everybody. I'm going to speak a brief speech about Zeno's paradox. I will anachronistic, but my speech will be anachronistic, because to speak about 5th century before Christ compels us to be anachronistic. I remind you some very simple and basic facts about mathematical analysis, as they were arranged in the second half of the 19th century. The most important number system are the natural numbers and the real numbers. The first one serves to count. The real number serves to measure. Between there are the integer, positive and negative, and the fractions or quotients. And the problems. Okay. You want to go to full screen? The full screen. Okay. Some other anachronistic remarks. According to the orderings, these set have different characteristics. Natural number and integer are discrete. Rational number are dense, which means that given any pairs of rational number, you can find a third number between. And real numbers are continuous, which means that there are no gaps in the line of real numbers. According to the quantity, how many they are, regarding cardinality, the first three systems are called numerable or countable, and the number which expresses this cardinal is aleph 0. The system of real numbers is said instead uncountable or not numerable or continuous, simply. The relative number is called C for continuum. If C is aleph 1, is an undecidable problem, the continuum hypothesis. The differences I mentioned between this numerical system entail that it makes no sense to talk of an enumeration of the real numbers. That is to say, that there is no definite rule or algorithm which will yield the series of real numbers. Speaking of the generation of the next real numbers makes no sense, because the rule does not turn on a tangible recursive operation such as +1, go to the successive. This is important for the understanding of the paradox. According to, now back to the 5th century before Christ. According to Aristotle, which largely speaks about the paradoxes, members of Pythagoras' school wrote that if the aim is to understand what there is and what happens in the world, then exploiting analogies with the natural numbers would have been much better than dwelling upon analogies with air, fire, earth, water, and so on. In this mental framework, discovering that there is no common ratio between the side and the diagonal of the square, which line 1, meaning that the square root of 2 cannot be expressed as the ratio between integer, and for this reason it is called an irrational number, entailed that the natural numbers turned out to be unable to represent the word complexity, lost their outstanding role. It was a dramatic shock, not only 500 before Christ. Do you remember? I remember that also in 1906, Robert Musil, the first novel published by Robert Musil, Die Verwirrungen des Säugling Turles, the turmoils or the confusion of the young turtles, was centered about the discovery of the irrational number. Anyway, after the crisis and before the birth of the new reorganization of the mathematical framework, thanks to the theory of proposition or proportions devised by Eudoxus of Cnidus in the 4th century before Christ, and then inserted in the Euclid's Elements. In this meantime, paradoxes thrive. All of them presupposes that whereas space is continuous and always divisible, time consists of indivisible instants. A time interval has a granular texture, and to be always anachronistic, motion consists of a series of snapshots taken successively. The most important, the most famous of Zeno's paradoxes is the so-called Achilles and the Tortoise. Imagine that Achilles, the fleetest of Greek warriors, is to run a foot race against a tortoise. It is only fair to give the tortoise a head start. Under these circumstances, Zeno argues, Achilles can never catch up with the tortoise, no matter how fast he runs. In fact, so argues Zeno, in order to overtake the tortoise, Achilles must run from his starting point, say A for Achilles, to the tortoise original starting point, say T for tortoise, T0. While he is doing that, the tortoise will have moved ahead to T1. Now Achilles must reach the point T1. While Achilles is covering this new distance, the tortoise moves still farther to T2. Again, Achilles must reach this new position of the tortoise, and so it continues. Whenever Achilles arrives at the point where the tortoise was, the tortoise has already moved a bit ahead, even if every time the new interval is less than that which he was pursuing in advance. Achilles can narrow the gap, but he can never actually catch up with him. In this paradox, Zeno assumed that distances and duration are infinitely divisible in the sense of having an actual infinity of parts. And he assumed that there are too many of these parts, for the runner to complete. Aristotle was the first to analyze deeply these paradoxes, Achilles and other, the arrow, and so on, in the sixth book of physics. According to Aristotle, Zeno should have assumed instead that there are only potential infinities, not actual infinities, so that at any time the hypothetical division into parts produces only a finite number of parts, and the runner has time to complete all these parts. Aristotle's treatment became the generally accepted solution until the 16th century. After the 16th century, after Leibniz, Newton, and other people, it has become common practice to solve this paradox by noting that the sum of infinitely many positive segments not necessarily produce a distance of infinite size. In fact, we learned that if the segments decrease continuously, as in this case, what is obtained is a finite sum. Achilles' task seems impossible because he would have to do an infinite number of things in a finite amount of time, referring to the number of gaps the hero has to close. But not all infinities are created the same. There are divergent series and convergent series. The most obvious divergent series is simply 1 plus 2 plus. There's no answer to that equation, or more precisely, the answer is infinity. If Achilles had to cover this sort of distances over the course of the race, in other words, if the tortoise were making progressively larger gaps rather than smaller ones, Achilles would effectively never catch the tortoise. But now consider the series 1 plus 1/2 and so on. Although the numbers go on forever, the series converges, and the solution is simply 2. As long as Achilles is making the gaps smaller at a sufficiently fast rate, so that their distances look more or less like the equation, he will complete the series in a measurable amount of time and catch the tortoise. This may seem impossible. Adding up an infinite number of positive distances should give an infinite distance for the sum. But a little reflection will reveal that this is so strange after all. If I can divide up a finite distance into an infinite number of small distances, then adding all those distances together should just give me back the finite distance I started with. But stop with anachronistic relationship, because we can now say something more shareable on the paradox. Speaking from a general, I have 3 simple remarks. Speaking from a general point of view, the paradox reveals a mismatch between the way we think about the world and the way the world actually is. In few words, space and time is assumed to be continuous, but in his argument, Zeno tries to break down space and time into discrete components. He argues discretely on a continuous matter, space and time into discrete components, and thereby to enumerate them, which is what cannot be done with the continuous quantities. To speak of the successive term of a sequence or of the next step of a process makes sense only if you are dealing with discrete quantities. My second general remark. Zeno's argument is rather to be an application of the reductio ad absurdum. However, it is not that clear to the nature of the obtained absurdum. it seems to consist in the contrast between the proved assertion, Achilles will never catch the tortoise, and the fact that Achilles, of course, catches the tortoise. However, we have to be careful because authorizing the occurrence of facts in the course of a proof opens the way to a contradictory system. The fact that Achilles moves would be a proof that motion exists, contrary to what Zeno intended to prove. The absurdum seems to finish with the proof of the assertion. This is not an absurdum. This is something which is a paradox, which goes against the shared opinion. But it is not a very reduction ad absurdum. And the last, I think that there is also a more radical solution of the paradox. This consists in taking into account that we absolutely do not need to believe that the mathematical space, temporal representation is meaningful for any, no matter how little physical quantity, as long as it is meaningful from a physical point of view. It is instead well-grounded, the assumption according to which that mathematical model is an idealization. It works with a basically simplified representation on the facts of a given experience domain, in which the accessible size ordering is represented. We can not do without idealization, but we have to remember always that they are idealization. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Enrico. I suppose perhaps what we have to hope as sustainability scientists is that we are in a convergent series, or how to move towards a convergent series as opposed to a divergent series, so that we can move closer towards our goal of sustainability, of living well within planetary boundaries. So we're going to move on to our keynote speaker now. And one of the main ideas in ecological economics is that efficient allocation in markets is not enough to solve environmental problems, that the physical scale of economic activity and the distribution of income and wealth are also critically important, as is, of course, a much better understanding of human behavior, moving beyond the idea of Homo economicus. Now, our keynote speaker this evening, Samuel Bowles, is an expert on human behavior, inequality, and the failure of free markets to deliver what they promise. Sam is a professor of economics at the University of Siena here in Italy, and a research professor at the Santa Fe Institute in the United States, where he directs the behavioral sciences program. He is a prolific writer and has published articles in journals ranging from Science and Nature to the American Economic Review. His current research includes theoretical and empirical studies of political hierarchy and wealth inequality and their evolution over the very long run. His studies have challenged the conventional economic assumption that people are motivated entirely by self-interest. And fun fact, there is also a great debate between him and Milton Friedman on YouTube, which you can find. Please join me tonight in welcoming Sam Bowles.
It's my very great pleasure to be here and to be joining you in this important conference. I hope I'll leave you with some hard work to do, questions that I will ask in the course of this brief lecture, which I couldn't answer, but we have to answer. Microphone, please. I have a microphone. Could we have more sound? Is that better? Is that good? Okay. What you see up here is the textbook, which I use as a first-year doctoral student. As you can see, it's Alfred Marshall. And I remember I was a little bit surprised to find that on the first page. I didn't know what it meant in the first place. Natura non facet saltum. I looked it up. And I thought it odd that it was there. We're asking today, what are we going to do with the fact that Marshall was wrong? Nature does take jumps. And we have to, therefore, as a society, prepare ourselves also to take jumps in terms of the kinds of paradigms that we adopt in our way of thinking and the kind of culture of sustainability. I'm simply repeating what the rector said earlier about the kinds of tasks we have ahead of us. So, natura non facet saltum. You may know that Leibniz used this expression in his new essays. He actually went one more. He said it never makes jumps. A century and a half later, Darwin used the expression 6 times in The Origin of Species. And you think about it, that hard problem that Darwin posed. Is it possible that he failed to solve the problem of the species because he was convinced that nature didn't take jumps? Because what, after all, is a new species? It's a dramatic innovation, a real discontinuity. Now, marginalism, therefore, is not something that economists invented. But following Marshall and Valra and others, it flourished in economics. When I was an undergrad, the Bible of my undergrad training, there it is, used the word incremental 73 times. Now, how odd is the word incremental to be used 73 times in a textbook? I thought then, and I actually asked one of my profs, what are you afraid of? Why are you just telling us that things only take small steps and don't take leaps? Well, here's the kind of thing that gets excluded if you're convinced that natura non facet saltum. I represent here a simple model of Arctic sea ice. On the horizontal axis is the sea ice in time 0, and here the sea ice a year later. The 45-degree line would be the sea ice continuing any point on that line. And the S-shaped curve is what geologists and others think is the way the ice works. So suppose we're here, there's a lot of ice. And if you have an intuition about how graphs like this work, that's a stable equilibrium. If you move a little more, then you go back to that equilibrium. Now, you can see in the graph, an equilibrium is a point on the 45-degree line. What it means is that's an equilibrium because it reproduces itself year after year. So the ice in year 0 is the same as the ice in year 1. Now, suppose that S-shaped curve is, you may wonder, why is it S-shaped? Well, I think you probably have studied enough about this problem to know that when the ice melts, then you absorb more heat because the dark water absorbs more heat than the iced water. And so the melting of the ice actually warms things up, and then you get more melting. Suppose in this graph that, and I don't seem to be able to, suppose in this graph that curve, the S curve, shifts down because of climate change. So there's a generic warming which reduces the sea ice. Well, you can see it first. The upper equilibrium of the sea ice will shift from up there where it was to down here. But eventually, if that S curve shifts down a little more, this upper equilibrium here disappears entirely. And then this whole area here, which was a stable geological setting for extensive Arctic sea and polar, generally, sea ice, would disappear. Then you get a cataclysmic decline here. Now, these points in between point A, those are what you call tipping points. If you pass the tipping point, you collapse. But what's more important and more likely is the tipping point simply disappears because the S curve shifts downward. Now, if you don't think that natura facet saltum, you wouldn't be interested in this kind of thing because this is a graph about how nature takes a leap. a really disastrous one for us. But what I want to pass on to you is this. Many of you, probably most of you, have studied economics. You didn't see this graph in it. What you saw is a graph like this, right? I think this graph is a lot more important than this graph. And it applies to a lot of things that we have to think about. Like, for example, this is a housing market. It's not sea ice. I use the same equations because why create new ones? This is the price of housing in time one. This is the price of housing in the future. You have the same kind of dynamics. If the price of housing goes up, the price of bread goes up, you buy less. If the price of housing goes up, you think, oh, if I buy a house and the price continues going up, then I'll have a more valuable asset. So oddly, when the price of housing goes up, you buy more rather than less. That's why we have instability in the housing market. That's this steep part of this curve here. Well, the same thing can happen in a housing market. And I could multiply the cases. These things are left out of your economics books because you're not supposed to be thinking about instability and cataclysmic changes in the world in which we live. So what I want to say here is really, it's about economics. Economics really dominates the way policymakers think. It dominates even the way the judicial establishment thinks in many countries. And we have to think about a fundamental change in what we do in economics. In order for that to have an impact, we have to think of what I would call a new policy paradigm. A policy paradigm, I'll say what it is in just a minute, but if you want to think of the kind of change that we absolutely have to get soon, in the next decade or two, I think a comparison is after World War II, after the Great Depression, in Europe and North America and some other countries, there was a fundamental shift in how we understood the economy. It had to do with putting together the confidence in the state, which the collaboration between business and government and so on during the Second World War had in many countries established, and the even more important concern for sustaining aggregate demand so as to avoid the Great Depression. That led to, that is a combination of the Great Depression and John Maynard Keynes' economics, led to a basic shift in how we thought about policy. 12 years after Keynes wrote the general theory, Paul Samuelson wrote his famous textbook. 12 years later. And Samuelson turned the world upside down. Can you imagine this? Go back and have a look. 1948, macroeconomics comes first. Microeconomics comes second in Samuelson's textbook. And in fact, on page 447 of Samuelson's textbook, he begins the discussion of supply and demand and perfect competition. That's where it begins. You want to know where it ends? Exactly 10 pages later. 10 pages later, and what he says is, that is all there is to the doctrine of perfect competition. All we have to see now is where it works. And he goes on to say where it doesn't work, for example, in labor markets. That was a fundamental shift. And of course, it was associated with the growing power of trade unions and social democratic parties. Well, I think facing this climate crisis and the political crises that will surround it, we may learn something from the previous paradigms in economics that have had this status of the way you look at the world, the way you understand it, and what you would like to accomplish in it. So let me just give you a brief summary. Here's a paradigm. I'll call it classical liberal. I'll give you some of the intellectual origins, obviously Mandeville, Hume, and so on. The problem they were addressing, chartered monopolies, traditional social hierarchies. They aspired to a system of governance consistent with individual freedom and economic dynamism, but was eventually supplanted because of the Great Depression, basically. The one I just described, the post-World War II one, let's call it Keynesian social democracy. There I have some of the intellectual origins. Again, it was an entirely new problem. It was economic insecurity and also injustice, economic inequality. The idea here was, and it was achieved in many places, a marriage of capitalist dynamism with social solidarity, shared affluence. And once again, I think this was supplanted by neoliberalism, that's the next line, it was supplanted because essentially Keynesian aggregate demand management met its limits in the 70s. And I think there was also what I call state fatigue. Finally, we have the neoliberal, and I won't go through all the steps, except the last one is, I think we can talk about neoliberalism in the past tense. We should stop criticizing it and move on, because we have important things to learn about what we should do instead. That's the task I'm leaving you. But there was a terrible failure of the neoliberals to generate growth. There was the financial instability, the climate emergency itself, and growing injustice, and so on. Okay, fill it in, please. That's a job for you. What goes there? Wendy Carlin and I wrote this a paper called Shrinking Capitalism, in which the title of the paper is a deliberate double entendre. That is, it's both descriptive and prescriptive. But I welcome a discussion about what goes in those headings. Now, what does it take? I've listed 3 very successful policy paradigms. That is, the classical liberal, the social democratic Keynesian, and the neoliberal. Successful in the sense of dominating many countries for a long period of time. Successful policy paradigms are not just economics. They embody a set of ethical principles which are consistent with how the economic model works. And if you think of the neoliberal, is a particular view of liberty, negative freedom, a limited view of freedom, which, if pursued by limiting governments, would make the economy work better if the model of the economy was an accurate model. So there's that kind of complementarity or synergy between the ethics of the frameworks and the economic models. But there are 2 other things that I think are equally important. Successful paradigms have emblematic policies. It's a new term. Let me tell you what I mean. For the neoliberals in the US, an emblematic policy was a policy which they could advocate, not necessarily very important, but one which embodied the moral ideals and the economic reasoning of the paradigm. So what was it in the US? School choice. What was it in the UK? You should own your own public housing, charter housing, Thatcher, and so on. These are brilliant innovations because they captured both the morality and the economic model. And we also need a new vernacular. How you talk about the economy has a lot to do with how you think about it, and I'll give you some examples. So here's the neoliberal. The normative foundations, I said negative freedom, procedural justice. The economic model, self-interest by both individuals and government officials. Competitive markets, very important. No interpersonal comparisons of utility, that is ordinal utility, and the associated use of the Pareto criterion. I've mentioned some things in the 3rd column. To give you some sense of the vernacular, the government governs best, that governs least. There's no such thing as society. You get what you pay for, and so on. So these are all ways that people came to think and speak about the economy. Here I've filled out the rest of the graph, still borrowing on my work with Wendy Carlin. But at the top, the normative foundations of the classical liberals were rule utilitarianism, individual autonomy from traditional hierarchies, and paternalism also, equal dignity in some sense from Adam Smith. And then it had its own vernacular, as you can see, some famous lines like, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, and the baker that we expect our dinner, and so on. And the same is true with the Keynesian. I won't bother going through them. You can find this paper, it's online, obviously. But I'm trying to lay out what I think what a paradigm has to do and be if it's going to be a success. It has to combine these 4 things. Normative foundations, a compatible economic model, emblematic policies, and a vernacular. Again, fill it in. This is a job. What goes there? I have some ideas, I'm sure you do too. Now let's think about an economics. What would economics look like if it was fit for a world in which natura facet saltum? Well, I want you to pause and think about economics as we know it. This quotation here from the American Economic Review: an economic transaction is a solved political problem. He means a complete contract. Economics has gained the title Queen of the Social Sciences by choosing solved political problems as its domain. Now I want to pause because that's a very deep thought. Abel Lerner was a very good neoclassical economist, also a socialist, by the way. And what he said is neoclassical economics succeeded because it focused on areas in which we could reduce our interactions with each other to transactions under complete contracts. And when he said, solve political problems, why is that? If everything between you and me is in the contract, there is no political problem between us, because if I don't do my bit of the contract, I don't deal with you, I call the cops and I enforce my contract against you. The state is involved in the politics of the contract, not you and me interacting game theoretically, for example, as an employer and employee would, or as a banker and a prospective lender would. So I love Abel Lerner's definition. But I want to add something else, which I think was really important. Economics gained the title Queen of the Social Sciences by representing the object of our studies as a smooth surface with a single peak. Take a salad bowl or a spaghettiera with a round bottom and turn it over. That's the world. No multiple. Is this too abstract? I think you know what I'm talking about. There's a single equilibrium, and we can study how you get there using calculus by small steps. That's why the marginal analysis works. Now, that's a brilliant view of the world. I'll turn over the salad bowl, and I'll reveal something that's really fantastic about that world, if you believe it. You have a spaghettiera with a round bottom, and you drop a ball in the thing. Where is it going to end up? Do you have to know where you dropped it? No, you don't. It'll be in the bottom of the bowl, because there's only one bottom of the bowl. Imagine instead that the world looked like an egg carton. You know, the thing that eggs come in. If you drop the ball, if you want to know where the ball's going to end up, you have to know where you dropped it, because it could end up in any of 6 places. Those two worlds are fundamentally different. The salad bowl world, history doesn't matter. All that matters is the dynamical processes which are leading you through gravity to go to the bottom of the bowl. If the world is an egg carton, you need more than gravity. You need more than optimization. You need history. You need accident. Now, the kingdom that Lerner said the Queen, neoclassical economics, ruled over, it was never very large, because some of the fundamental markets in a capitalist economy are not characterized by complete contracts. As every business person and every lawyer knows, and as almost all economists know, at least if they've studied in doctoral programs, undergraduates, unfortunately, are still taught that markets clear because contracts are complete. But the realm of complete contracts, I joke with my students, why is grocery shopping so often included in economics textbooks as examples? It's because it's one of the few places where you have more or less a complete contract. Why don't they use the labor market? Which Samuelson said, oh, by the way, don't use this for that. But we don't use it for the labor market because intuitively we know that that's not a market in which the contract is complete. If you employ me to work, what you've done is rented my time. You've not acquired my effort. To do that, you have to interact with me in some way that will complete the contract, either because of my norm, my wish to do a good job, or because you threatened to fire me. And that's so there's things left out. It's interesting what is left out: power and norms. So immediately you get great political scientists like Robert Dahl, my undergraduate teacher, about power, or you get Durkheim about social norms as a necessary part of understanding how wages are set. By the way, I'm not urging interdisciplinarity on you because you ought to be more open to sociology. I'm urging interdisciplinarity on you because if you don't understand social norms, you can't understand prices. Now, there's another aspect of the conventional paradigm that it seems to me is going to have to change. And now I'll give you the very familiar definition of economics, nowhere near as interesting as Alba Lerner. Economics is the study of human behavior as a relationship between given ends and scarce means. Oh, so economics doesn't consider situations in which values change, or situations in which, for example, things are organized so as to change values. Now, what I want to suggest is that rejecting all three of these, the given ends of Robbins, the complete contracts of Lerner, and the thing which I added, the smooth services and the single optimum or single maximum, these are the things we have to get rid of if we're going to develop an economics to address the world we're now in which nature is taking big leaps. Now, to do this, we need not just the policy paradigm, the four parts I said, but I want to turn now to the economic part and say what it might look like. I'll begin with given ends. There's a tendency when economists address environment is they think, I mean, essentially what we do is we think about the problem, and then mathematically, we refer to what's called mechanism design. A mechanism is a set of laws or incentives or prohibitions, and we try to figure out some mechanism that will result in implementing an outcome that we would like in some sense. Now, by the way, I think this is a very good idea. The classical economists did the same. Adam Smith didn't start with a set of institutions and resources and say, oh, if you let things happen, then what's the outcome going to be? No. Adam Smith and also John Locke and Hume and all of them, they started with the kind of society in which you would like to live. And then they tried to reverse engineer what would be the institutions such that that society could persist and would work. Now, that's what mechanism design does. But the problem is this. Mechanism design typically assumes what are called unrestricted preferences. That means people can have any preferences they want. Now, the bad news is that if you really allow people to have any preferences they want, it's almost impossible even to have a Pareto efficient outcome to many, many simple bargaining and exchange problems. So allowing people to be as selfish and as self-interested or amoral as you want really is a huge challenge in policymaking. That is, this economists, I think, were until the 80s pretty confident that we could invent prices that would do the work of morals. You understand what I mean? Prices would do the work of morals. We wouldn't have to be good people. If we got the prices right, we would act as if we were good, just maximizing our profits. 3 Nobel Prizes were awarded to people in mechanism design because they showed that wasn't true. Now, so let's think about this. As we confront the environmental problems of today and the climate emergency, our values are going to change. Our values are going to change because we're going to see the world differently. They're also going to change because of the policies we adopt. And one thing I hope we can do, learn more about, is this. Let's try to adopt policies that will increase the number of green citizens. In other words, let's think about constitutions the way Aristotle thought about constitutions, which is constitutions are a teacher. Aristotle said, the thing that distinguishes a good constitution from a bad one is whether or not the Constitution will produce good citizens. Well, that's a very foreign idea to economics, but we'd better start thinking about that, because I really fear that we're not going to solve the climate emergency with the preferences that we have today, or what I mean is the distribution of preferences in the world population. We have to think about endogenous preferences. I've recently done work over the past couple of years on vaccination resistance. And the question I was asking with the lead author of this project is Katrin Schmelz, a German psychologist and behavioral economist. The question we asked is, are you okay with being vaccinated if it's voluntary? Are you okay with being vaccinated if it's mandated? We were not asking about compliance. We were just asking, how do you feel about it? And what we found was really extraordinary. The height of this thing is how much, for example, here if you have a tracing app, this height here is how much more okay they were with it if it was voluntary than if it was mandated. So in other words, what it means is they didn't mind tracing apps, but if they were mandated, they hated them. In other words, the way the policy was designed was actually cultivating an opposition to the policy itself. It was never introduced. But getting vaccinated was very similar. Huge differences. And by the way, we did this in a panel, so we were watching the same people over time. It increased. This is just an example of introducing a policy that's undermining the support that you need to then have more policies. And now, we've recently done the same thing with environmental policies, such things as not eating meat or not driving your car and so on. And as you can see, the vertical axes are the same. This crowding out, it's called control aversion in behavioral economics. Control aversion is much worse is much worse in the environmental case. Now you say, well, why don't we just implement the policy and then enforce it? Well, I don't think you have to go very far in Italy, or certainly not in my country, America, to just understand how very, very difficult it is to implement a policy that people don't support. In the United States, it's not just that people don't wear masks, it's that the police won't enforce policies which they don't like. And by the way, I don't think this is a particularly rare problem. And that's Katrin Schmelz. Okay, so I said I wanted to talk about a new paradigm in economics. I use the word paradigm here the way Thomas Kuhn did. Now, Kuhn, as you probably know, he was writing about chemistry and physics, but it really applies to us as well. He defines a paradigm in the following way. It asks, what are the fundamental entities under study? How do they interact with each other? What questions may legitimately be asked about such entities? And what techniques employed in seeking solutions? And then very interestingly, he said, a paradigm, say in chemistry or in biology, or I would say in economics, the answers to questions like this are the educational initiation that prepares and licenses the student for professional practice. So a paradigm is what good undergraduates learn. The thing that every economist should know. That's what Kuhn called a paradigm. So now talking about an economic paradigm, what are we be talking about? Well, if we have a paradigm like neoclassical economics or Marxian economics, a paradigm has to answer questions like, what are people like? The second is, how do we relate to each other and to nature? The third is, how do we make predictions? Another is, how do we evaluate outcomes? These are basic questions. Now, most people practicing a particular paradigm don't even think about those questions. That's just what they learn. But the people who founded the paradigm probably did, like Alfred Marshall and Balra. So, what would a new paradigm look like? I'm not going to leave the right-hand column blank for you to fill out because I thought I had to actually, do something here. So I will fill out the right-hand column. The left-hand column is the topic. The middle column is the conventional what's taught, let's say, in say Mankiw or Krugman and Wells or any of the textbooks, including at the second-year level. About people, Homo economicus. A new benchmark should include endogenous social preferences and cognitive limits. I'll run through this rather quickly. I think it's my idea of what we should be building, and before I end, I'll say where it's actually happening. Nature. It's not really there in the standard undergraduate paradigm, but the economy is part of the biosphere. The economy is part of the social system and part of the biosphere. Information, you know, in the standard view, it's complete. We know, of course, and not just about the environment, it's radically incomplete. It's asymmetric, and we have radical uncertainty about really important things in which we don't even know the likely distributions with which we're dealing. Contracts, as a result of the information problems that I just mentioned, contracts are complete in the standard view, and therefore, I mean, notice how important this is. If a contract is complete, there are no external effects, right? A complete contract has in the contract everything that matters to everybody. So saying complete contracts means you get rid of externalities. Now, what I've been interested in is the fact that when the worker works harder, that's a benefit for the employer. Or when the borrower of funds acts prudently, that's good for the banker. Those are external effects. But old-fashioned external effects, like environmental effects, are part of the story too. So adopting a world with complete contracts means putting aside all of those externalities. This is important. Technology. Non-increasing returns. I wonder if Marshall was so brilliant that he understood the problem of increasing returns. He dealt with it very, very thoroughly. Now, the problem with increasing returns, obviously, is that if firms face a downward sloping average cost curve, then you have winner-take-all competition. The marginal cost is less than the average cost, and marginal cost pricing means losses for the firm. And therefore, firms cannot charge marginal costs, and therefore the entire welfare economics of the invisible hand goes out the window. Now, Marshall was actually Marshall, like Smith and Marx, but unlike many other economists, really understood a lot about the economy. And he might have been worried about this fact, that is, if you have increasing returns, or any other positive feedback, such that more is increasingly better, you're going to have this kind of winner-take-all competition. We have, in a new benchmark, the technologies would be endogenous and there would be increasing returns. But I don't want you to think about increasing returns just as something about a production function. Remember the sea ice. That was a kind of increasing returns. It was a positive feedback. The warmer it got, the harder it got to sustain the ice, or the house prices too. So when you think about what gives rise to these S-shaped curves and these tipping points, it's any kind of positive feedback, of which increasing returns in the production function sense is just one. I mean, a kind of, you know, what's a positive feedback? Well, why is English sweeping the world? English is sweeping the world because English is sweeping the world. It could have been Swahili, but it turned out to be English. And that's, I mean, we see these things all the time. The competition, perfect competition among price-taking agents, monopolistic or monopsonistic, and winner-take-all competition. Now, once again, the textbooks do include, at least monopolistic competition. Firms face downward-sloping demand curves, but the standard view is the firm facing a U-shaped long-run average cost curve and a flat demand curve. And that's the view of the world that we learn. And then we have these things which are called imperfect. Joan Robinson was a great economist, but she did a disservice by calling monopoly imperfect competition, an imperfection of something which was the way the world really works. Power. Power in the standard paradigm, it exists. There's market power. That's a downward sloping demand curve. There's the government. But whatever it is, it's just there. It's exogenous. In the paradigm I'm talking about, as you may have guessed already, Power takes the form of domination of some people over others, as, for example, the person who offers a job to a person who's desperately poor and needs it is in a position not to object to taking orders, carrying them out, even to sexual harassment, racial insults, and so on. And then instability. Well, we know what the conventional view says, and our view says that's not true. Evaluation. I come back to Pareto efficiency and ordinal preferences, or ordinal utility. I would add over on our side, sustainability, dignity, equal dignity, undominated personal relations, and cardinal utility. Now, when I was being trained in economics, there were two things you could do to show that you were no good as an economist. The first thing is you could be against free trade, and the other is that you could think that cardinal utility made sense. Now, I mean, I'm sure you all heard the reasons, but does anybody remember why cardinal utility is so stupid? Do you remember? We can't know other people's feelings. Think about what it would mean to be a person who acted as if cardinal utility didn't make any sense. Would you want to share a flat with that person? They would be a sociopath. They would be unable to say, oh, don't worry, I'll take out the garbage today. It's less trouble for me than it is for you. You can't say it's less trouble for me than it is for you because you just compared marginal utilities. The most elementary statements of morality and friendship have to do with the obvious thing, which is we care about other people's well-beings and we have a sense of how they're doing. And we compare that with our own. How economics got persuaded that all we needed was Pareto and we didn't need Bentham or something like Bentham is really awful. I mean, that happened because Bentham gives very strong statements about justice and Pareto gives you nothing. And that's why it happened. It's not about psychology. It's not what we cannot or cannot know. It's that economics wanted to get the issue of justice off the table, and they did. Okay, I want to wind up. This is the last time there was a big shift in the paradigm, and much bigger than neoliberalism, and much more successful in terms of its duration. What can we learn from that? That's a long topic. I've studied a lot. I knew Paul Samuelson when he had become, I thought he was conservative. He used to complain about his Marxist students. And when I went back and read what he had done in the 40s, I got very interested in the environment. By the way, he was almost kicked out of MIT because he was said to be a communist, which is absolutely not at all true, by one of the members of the board of trustees of MIT, because he was arguing this position about society first, individualism second. Now, I'll end with, I'm sorry, but there are some things which we have in common today. And the good news is we have a confluence of a really big problem, like the Great Depression, and some really good economics, which is capable of addressing it, like the economics of Keynes and his successors and the people who taught him. The problem is this. In the 1940s and 50s, social democratic parties and labor unions across the high-income countries developed policies which they could go to the electorate with and their members with, which were immediate benefits for their membership, and which also expanded the realm of the government in the Keynesian and social democratic direction. And that's why you have social democratic parties winning elections and dominating in some countries over many decades, for example, in Sweden, and so on. What I don't see here is the kinds of policies we can now advocate that would have that benefits here and now, while also saving us for the future, just the way unemployment insurance was a great benefit to people, but it also really did moderate the business cycle. I'm aware there are many good policies having been proposed. I think one thing we should think about is the carbon tax and citizen dividend. It has been, it's very unpopular in many countries. I think it has not been well explained, but it has the ability to make a big difference in terms of carbon use, and it can be very egalitarian if it's just a lump sum transfer. Now, I know many people think that it should be used for good purposes rather than being distributed to citizens, but this is a political battle we're fighting now, and we have to win that one. That's a frightening picture. For the past 10 years, a group of us, including a great many people, some in this room, but also in Siena and other parts of the world, have been trying to develop that right-hand column as an introductory textbook. And this is new science. Everything is free. It's all online. You can get it on your phone right now. I won't be insulted if I see you going on your phone. We have 3 or 4 different courses. It's now the required introductory economics course in probably more than half of the courses in the UK and in some of the top universities like Toulouse School of Economics, not to mention my own University of Siena and other places. It adopts a lot of the principles which I was talking about. And what's heartening to me is that it's doing very well. Now, it could be because the price is right, namely 0. But dislodging the old religion from an economics curriculum is really, really hard. And so, for example, this year it's now being taught at Princeton and at UCLA and so on. I don't know, I mean, it's been created by a group of people, 30 or so economists and researchers, and it's a cooperative. No one has been paid 1 penny, not a penny. We created this as a cooperative, and it's free. And obviously, that's causing a certain amount of concern on the part of Mankiw and Krugman and others. But I want to go beyond education. I want to see if we can fill in those blanks so that a new policy paradigm can become a living reality in our societies, and we can deal with the climate emergency in a way that ensures social justice today and for future generations. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. Is this microphone? So I think we maybe have about 10 minutes for questions. Is that about right, Tommaso? I think, Sam, there are many things that you've presented that are going to appeal to ecological economists. The sort of discussion of ends and means is something that is really foundational to ecological economics. Your salad bowl example as well, one of the big challenges in ecological economics is trying to think about problems not as optimization problems with a single optimum, but thinking about problems where the goal or where what we're trying to achieve is multiple non-substitutable goals. And so I think some of these ideas are really core to ecological economics, as well as some of the elements of the alternative paradigm, I think are areas that ecological economists are thinking about and trying to articulate how we could achieve this alternative paradigm, because I think there's a realization that the current paradigm certainly isn't working. It's driving us towards inequality. It's driving us beyond planetary limits, towards ecological breakdown. And so there is this great challenge of how we actually achieve that paradigm shift. And I think many of the ideas you shared are things that we would fundamentally agree with, but how do we actually get that to happen in the time that we have, which, if we look at the ecological science, is very short. So I'd like to lead with that question, and maybe we can collect some other questions as well. We might try to collect a few questions at a time, given the shortage of time, and bring those to Sam as well.
Could I request that the first question from the floor be from a student and from a woman?
You certainly may.
Not every discipline is like that, but economics is really unusually sexist, and it's time we did something about it.
Hi, can you hear me? I'm Sophia, and I'm talking tomorrow in the special session on innovation about the cultural history of symbols and images used in economic paradigms and urban ecological transitions. So my question is a bit left field, but I just wondered, given that symbols are so important to communicating paradigm shifts, which symbol would you think is appropriate to your new economic paradigm? Thank you.
Do we want to collect a couple other questions at the same time, just so we can collect as many as we can in the time? Yeah. And Tommaso is running around with the microphone. I think we have a couple questions over here.
While the mic is being moved, could you tell me what your favorite symbol would be? I think it's such a beautiful question. I just love it. I already told you that this has to be outlawed. Supply and demand, forget it. But what do you have in mind?
Grazie. I think symbols are both important and dangerous because they obviously simplify complex ideas. And I love the circle, but I think fundamentally it's ignoring a lot of important political questions with the circular economy. So I think we need something perhaps more messy. And I've been thinking about Kandinsky. I don't know if you know his paintings.
I was thinking the same thing.
But something along the lines of a Kandinsky painting.
And I think we did have the question over here, I think, and then one over on this side too. Yeah.
Hello, Tiago Domingos from Lisbon. Thank you for the great and very stimulating talk. And also congratulations to you and everyone else in the room for this fantastic core economics project. I really think this is really important. What I wanted to pitch in is also based on what Dan O'Neill said initially about the founding framework of ecological economics. And namely the contributions of Nicholas Djurjevsko-Rogan that Dan mentioned, but I would also like to bring in Bob Ayers and the fundamental understanding that we cannot understand the biosphere, the economy, and the economy within the biosphere without bringing in thermodynamics. And something that I would like to pitch into the new framework that you're presenting is when you talk about technology, and which is this point that we don't want just a biophysical framing to understand the interaction of the economy with the biosphere. What the work of Bob Ayers and people working with him has shown, and after him, and building on what he has worked, is that the laws of thermodynamics allow us to understand what's going on inside the economy. It's not just about the interaction of the economy with nature. And namely, and this goes to your line in the new paradigm on technology, which I think that a fundamental contribution that ecological economics can bring to the understanding of technology in the new paradigm, starting to feel the pressure, is understanding, having fundamental natural science and engineering knowledge in understanding how technology works. And namely, when you and I think that's consensual here in the room when we talked about the whole progress that we made in post-World War II. It's about a new paradigm, about new social ideas, but it was also about the harnessing of what the second industrial revolution machines could do for us in expanding and making the cake bigger and easier to distribute. And in fact, what we see using thermodynamics is that from the 70s onwards, technology was no longer giving that to us. And so in fact, from an ecological economics perspective, we can fully understand the whole neoliberal paradigm from the 70s as the running out of this thermodynamic bounty that the second industrial revolution gave us.
Question up here, Tommaso, yeah.
Thank you. My question is much simpler. I think we must take a very clear look that time is short for climate change, biodiversity loss, jumping points. Nature is not only making one jump, it's really hopping around. Okay, so then I see a very concrete example. Someone was building a new house on the place of an old one and is destroying the old one because it is cheaper to demolish and build a new one. Of course, it's a money balance, not an energy balance, not a material balance. How do we get a political system where simply we throw away, or there are less polite words, the monetary balance and just enforce that the minimum investment in energy and material is what is a decisive criterion? So that is not framing the economy, that is transforming the economy to a physical basis. Thank you.
Maybe we take one more question and then we give Sam a chance to respond.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just interested in knowing whether you... Okay, I'm Clive Spash. I'm just interested in knowing whether you have considered anything except for capitalism in your work, because your entire talk to me seems to be based around a concept called the economy, and the economy is singular, which sounds like you don't have any conceptualization except for American capitalism, I would say, or maybe going back in history to British. So I'd be interested if you've ever thought about alternative economies besides that, and also in terms of the way you talk about things, this core framework as well is very much embedded in the very mainstream kind of approaches, it seems to me. Your whole talk and presentation was really a reflection on the mainstream and how to tweak it rather than cause a paradigm shift.
Okay, so let's give Sam a chance to respond. So we've got capitalism, politics, thermodynamics, symbols, and time is running out. No small challenge addressing all of those.
If I could have the mic, if I could have the mic, that'd be better. Otherwise, I have to. Thanks, everyone, for your questions. There's a lot to think about, and obviously, I can't answer it with any seriousness. All of these questions, including the thermodynamics as part of the economy, is obviously a good idea. And I mean, it's an essential part of understanding how it works. I sometimes see models of the thermodynamics of the economy which have gone to the extreme of really extracting people and their actions. That is, people intentionally trying to accomplish things and being thwarted or not. So thermodynamics plus game theory is my idea about what the kind of way we should be thinking about that. Your question, I've actually spent a lot of time thinking about other economies. In fact, I mostly write about hunting and gathering societies. And I've also written about worker-owned firms and aspirationally about socialism. So there's no sense in which I think that's the only possibility. It's true that it's basically the only show in town now, but that doesn't mean from an intellectual standpoint, we can't learn a lot about not only what we might like to have instead, for example, democratic socialism, but it also helps us understand better how capitalism works. You say that core is just tweaking neoclassical economics. I find that pretty surprising, because if you look at what the neoclassical theory says about homo economicus and complete contracting and unique equilibria and so on, the world in core is really a different world. Now, many people say, oh, you use graphs and you use math. That looks just like what I learned in school. Sorry, math is not the problem. The problem is what is being mathematized. So the fact that we use indifference curves, I've actually heard this. People said, use indifference curves. That's the same old, some expletive word there. I mean, I just don't think that's very reasonable. Now, a question does get raised, however, what's the role of markets? Now, I think that markets are an extraordinary device for decentralizing information. I'm a great admirer of Friedrich Hayek in that respect. Hayek's economics, which was not at all neoclassical, he was a very severe critic of the so-called perfectly competitive model, from which he said competition had been entirely eradicated. Hayek's economics helps us understand the dynamic process, or what he called the creativity of the market. I think that's something worth having, and we would feel less opposed to markets if we had wealth equalization, so that the market didn't translate the wealth of the wealthy into these tremendous market advantages. I think there is a lot wrong with markets too. Many of my experiments, I mean, I wrote a book about what's wrong with markets from a cultural standpoint, in the sense that they may encourage individualism and self-interest and so on. So there's the cultural side of markets, which I think is very important, particularly for the kind of thing we're talking about. I don't think some of you made statements with which I agreed. I haven't answered you all, and I wish I could, but I guess our time is up. Thank you so much. I appreciate your coming and being interested in this and what you said. I wish I could have heard more.
Thank you, Sam. Tommaso back up here on the local organizing committee to take things from here.
Are you coming to the concert?
Yes, I'll come to the cocktail for sure. Where is it?
Yes, c'è close to the department of stazione we are walking all together.
I'll get one of my former CNA students to tell me.
Yeah. Also, there is Giovanni. He wants he will come to the dinner, to the cocktail, and the concert.
And the concert
is no, stazione Leopoldo. I'll Tiziano. And now there are some announcements from the lock, so don't go away, please. So the session hasn't finished.
Should we?
I'll give you some practical information and also methodological information about the conference. So here is the core of the LOC, of the local organizing committee. Janne, she is a student in Norway, and she took an internship here during the autumn. And Tiziano Di Stefano is a researcher in the Department of Economics, and Claudia, she is from IRTA Leonardo, and she is the creator of the website, among the many things. And of course, there were many other colleagues that helped, and so we are very grateful also to them. But yeah, what is that? You're setting limits, okay? Tim Foxon, where is Tim Foxon? Where is he? Could you stand up? Yeah. Tim Foxon as the T-shirt of these setting limits. Thank you, Tim. Sorry for that. So this was a great conference that was organized in 2001 and 2003 in Cambridge first and in Tenerife. Then Clive was one of the main contributors for organizing that. And as you can see, he's setting limits, a new cultural awareness, okay? And so in a sense, this conference is about limits, okay? And also, maybe nothing new under the sun, because if you read Our Common Future, then just the row after the usual definition, we have, it contains within two key concepts, and this is literally what is written in the Brundtland report. The first one is the concept of needs. So we have been told the fake news that the sustainable development is about future and present generation. Sustainable development is about needs. If you read the Brundtland report, it speaks about needs. Second, the idea of limitations. Technological limitation, social limitation, environmental limitation. This was the Congress Hall that was available when I candidate Pisa to host this conference. This is a very nice hall for more than 700 persons, but the hall is not available anymore because I don't know, because something doesn't work very well, so they decided to close it, and they did not even to the rector. The rector asked the technician personally several times, at least to give us the ground floor for the coffee break and the lunches. Nothing. Bureaucracy has not allowed us to be there. So limits, we have space limits. So we are forced to have plenaries, but for today, in the other days, to have plenaries in 2 rooms at the same time. And thanks to the work of these great teams, they will connect the room, and we hope to put the speaker in 2 different rooms. So we apologize for this, but we have limits. We have space limits, logistic limits. Also, we have time limits. This conference is rather short or rather long, and 3.5 days, more than 500 participants. And of course, we have too many parallels. Policy measures that we took. You have noticed that we start 8:45. You might have noticed that Friday is a full-day conference, while in some other conferences, Friday was only for the closing in some cases. Also, we have different time for coffee breaks to avoid peaks. Okay? So some session will start at 2:15, some others at 2:30. This is not a punishment for those to limit your time, but it's only to reduce peaks. Lightning talks. We try to encourage you to have lightning talks, 5-minute talks. We will have 5-minute talks. They are rather an innovation in our conferences, but and so we didn't get so many applications for lightning talks. But the idea is that those kind of conferences are a place where meeting colleagues, and so maybe 5-minute talks is enough for saying what the person is working at. And traditional, very short time, 12 minutes plus 3 for questions. And since we don't have time, we have time limitations, we give priority to collecting all questions. Okay? We wrote in the introduction questions without answers. Of course, it's a provocation, but priority has to be given to questions. What is important, and I'll tell it to all the chairs and also all the participants in the special in the parallels, just ask questions, because questions are the most important part of what a speaker can, because the speaker needs hints. And of course, it is not saying that we don't have to have discussions, but we can have discussions at lunches, coffee breaks, bars, beers, and the rest. So this is why, so I had to explain some strange things and unusual things in this conference. And so yeah, we have limitations. And as ecological economists, we should be the first to be aware and accept limitation and try to overcome the fact that we have limitation. And so this is the main message. Now, what's going on now? We are moving. We are moving to Stazione Leopolda. Sorry, yes. Sorry.
No, sorry, just to add the thing. I mean, we apologize if we bombed you with a lot of emails. It was not stalking, but we recognize that we have limitations also on organization, because I mean, our mantra of this conference is that full configuration is impossible.
Yeah, maybe I can. Yeah, we put everything on the website. So please go on the website. Sometimes somebody asks me, what time is it that? And I don't remember. We don't remember. Please look at the website, because the information is correct, is right on the website. So so in any case, we are moving. I don't even remember where the map on the website is. Oh, yeah. No, anyway, okay. Oh, this is the map. We are more or less here. And okay, then we will walk together. We have several shepherds outside. We have flags to guide us. And then we will go in the Borgo Stretto, which means narrow street. Then we walk along the Lungarno River. We cross the Fortress Bridge. Then we walk here, and then we arrive here, where Stazione Leopolda is. It was an old station. Tomorrow, and then today we will have a cocktail and then a concert. The concert will be a comparison between Vivaldi and Piazzolla. They both wrote seasons, and so it will be. Then here is the conference venue. In the morning, we will stay in the Department of Economics, Dipartimento Economia e Management, DEM, and then in the afternoons, we will stay in Polo Piaggia. This for Wednesday and Thursday. On Friday, we will remain here in the Department of Economics. Friday is bank holiday here in Pisa. The night of Thursday is a very special night, because thousands of candles will lighten in the Lungarno, along the river and on the buildings, and also thousands of people. And Any questions? Only questions without answer. Yes. Yes, you have to follow the people with the T-shirt and the flags. We have some spare T-shirt, but we won't distribute them until Friday, because otherwise you will wear it and you will look as a volunteer. So if you want a T-shirt now, you have to volunteer if you want to wear it. So this is some images of the Luminara, how it will appear. Okay, so we will move downstairs, and in 5 minutes we will walk together to the Stazione Leopolda, and if you get lost, you won't get the cocktail.